The old black-and-white photograph, dated 1908, lay flat on the light table, unassuming. At first glance, it was just another glimpse into a bygone era, a frozen moment of a bustling urban scene. You could almost hear the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the murmur of 1,000 conversations. It showed what looked like a busy market square, probably in some European capital, judging by the architecture. People moved in a chaotic dance, some haggling over goods, others simply passing through. Nothing about it screamed extraordinary. It was typical, really, of the thousands of historical images preserved from that period. This particular photograph had a quiet history. It wasn't famous, hadn't captured a pivotal moment, or featured a recognizable historical figure. It was just a slice of everyday life. It was discovered tucked away in a dusty box of miscellaneous papers in an old attic, part of an estate donation to a local historical society. The person who took it was unknown, their identity lost to time, much like many of the faces captured within its frame. For decades, it had sat in storage, occasionally pulled out for an exhibition on early 20th century street life, then dutifully returned to its dark, climate-controlled drawer. Its value was purely historical, offering insights into the fashion of the time, the types of goods sold, and the general rhythm of city existence before the Great War changed everything. When it first came to the attention of historical researchers, their analysis was straightforward. They noted the intricate details of the women's hats, the rough textures of the men's suits, the advertisements painted on the side of a building, now faded and barely legible. They discussed the architectural styles, the type of cobblestones used in the square, and even the varieties of produce laid out on stalls. It was a rich tapestry of mundane historical data, a window into a world that felt both familiar and incredibly distant. The photograph had a surprisingly high resolution for its age, a testament to the photographer's skill and the quality of the original print. This clarity was what would eventually allow for a much more detailed and ultimately unsettling examination. The initial digital scan of the photograph was a standard procedure. It was part of a larger project to digitize the entire collection of the Historical Society, making these valuable archives accessible to a wider audience. The impact on the researchers at that stage was primarily one of convenience. Instead of handling the fragile original, they could now zoom in on a screen, share images easily, and conduct their research without fear of damaging the physical artifact. It was a step forward, an embrace of modern technology to preserve the past. Little did they know this very technological advancement would soon unveil something that would challenge their understanding of that past, setting the stage for a deeper, more unsettling revelation. The photograph's journey through various archives and historical societies had been unremarkable, a slow drift through the quiet corridors of preservation, from the attic to the local society, then to a larger regional archive, and finally, for its high-resolution scanning, to a specialized digital preservation lab. It had been handled by countless gloved hands, catalogued, cross-referenced, and filed away. Each time, it was seen as a valuable, yet ordinary, piece of history, a quiet document of a bygone era, waiting patiently for the moment its true, hidden nature would finally be brought to light. It was a simple piece of paper, but it held a secret, a detail so subtle, so out of place that it had escaped notice for over a century. The ordinary was about to become extraordinary, and not in a good way. The feeling of everyday life it portrayed was about to be shattered by a single, terrifying detail. A team of digital archivists, led by Dr. Evelyn Reed, began the routine high-resolution scan of the 1908 photograph. Their lab was state-of-the-art, filled with humming servers and specialized scanners designed to capture every speck of detail from historical documents. The process was meticulous, a slow dance between technology and preservation. Each photograph was carefully placed, light settings adjusted, and then the scanner would hum, capturing millions of pixels. Their primary goal was to create a perfect digital replica, removing the dust and scratches that time had inevitably etched onto the original print. This digital restoration was painstaking work, often involving hours spent carefully cleaning up image artifacts, pixel by pixel, to ensure the highest fidelity. Sarah, a junior archivist with a keen eye for detail, was assigned to the 1908 photograph. She was relatively new to the team, but possessed a natural curiosity that often led her to spend extra time poring over images, looking for tiny overlooked elements. As she worked on the digital restoration, she zoomed in and out, cleaning up a faded corner here, sharpening a blurry edge there. The photograph, with its bustling street scene, was a typical example of urban life from that era. People walked, vendors sold their wares, Carriages moved slowly through the square. It was all very normal, very much what one would expect from a snapshot of 1908. One afternoon, while working on a particularly dense section of the photograph, a crowded area near a lamppost, Sarah performed a casual zoom. She was trying to clean up some digital noise that blurred the faces of several individuals in the background. As she pushed the magnification higher, she noticed something odd. A subtle, barely perceptible distortion seemed to ripple through the background, specifically around one very tall, slender figure standing slightly apart from the main crowd. It wasn't a blur, not exactly, but more like a slight warping of the pixels around this individual, as if the light itself bent around him. Her immediate thought was that it was a photographic artifact, a common issue with old prints, maybe a slight tremor from the original photographer, or a chemical imperfection during development. Lens flare was another possibility, or perhaps just a ripple in the fabric of the image itself. She made a mental note to address it during the final cleanup pass. For now, she continued with her routine, dismissing it as a minor anomaly. But as she continued to work on the surrounding areas, cleaning up other parts of the photograph, her eyes kept drifting back to that spot. The distortion, though subtle, seemed to have a recurring pattern, almost like a faint shimmering outline. It wasn't random noise. It was too consistent, too specific to that one figure. A prickle of unease started to form in the back of her mind. It was the kind of feeling you get when something is just slightly off, but you can't quite put your finger on why. Driven by this growing unease, Sarah decided to isolate the specific area. She used the lab's advanced software to crop the section around the figure and then applied a series of enhancement algorithms. These weren't just for cleaning. They were designed to sharpen details, bring out contrast, and sometimes to reveal what the naked eye might miss. The process was slow, the computer crunching data, trying to make sense of the faint information hidden within the pixels. As the algorithms worked, the form of the figure began to resolve itself with more clarity. It was definitely a man, or at least something humanoid, but the distortion around him became more pronounced, not less, as if the enhancement was making the anomaly itself clearer. The figure was unnaturally tall, slender, and seemed to loom over the other people in the crowd, even though he was standing slightly behind them. His posture was stiff, almost rigid, unlike the natural, flowing movements of the people around him. The gradual revelation of this form was unsettling. It was indistinct, still somewhat blurry despite the enhancements, but undeniably out of place. The other archivists in the lab, noticing Sarah's intense focus, started to gather around her screen. Their initial reactions were a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Dr. Reed, her supervisor, leaned in, her brow furrowed. "What have you got there, Sarah?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an underlying note of professional intrigue. "I'm not sure, Dr. Reed," Sarah replied, pointing at the screen. "It looks like a distortion, but it's not behaving like a typical artifact. It's almost like it's part of the subject." The team's initial thoughts still gravitated towards technical explanations. Could be a double exposure, one suggested, or maybe motion blur from a slow shutter speed, offered another. But Sarah shook her head. "I've tried to correct for those. The distortion moves with the figure, not independently." They watched as Sarah continued to apply filters, trying to peel back the layers of digital noise and photographic age. The figure remained, a dark, elongated shape amidst the vibrant, everyday bustle of 1908. It was positioned almost perfectly within the crowd, camouflaged by the sheer number of people. Yet once seen, it was impossible to unsee. It was like a trick of the eye, where a pattern emerges from chaos. The more they looked, the more it solidified. The feeling in the lab shifted from mere technical interest to something a bit more unnerving. The anomaly wasn't going away. It was insisting on its presence, demanding attention. Further detailed enhancement of the image started to reveal more distinct features of the anomaly, deepening the sense of unease in the lab. The figure was clearly human-like in its general outline, but its proportions and posture were unmistakably wrong. It was unnaturally tall, far exceeding the average height of people in that era, or any era for that matter. Its limbs seemed too long, too thin, making it appear gaunt, almost stretched. A long, dark shadow stretched out from its feet, oddly pronounced despite the bright midday sun, captured in the photograph, as if it absorbed more light than it reflected. This shadow didn't quite match the angles of the other shadows cast by the bustling crowd, adding another layer of visual discord. Its clothing was another point of unsettling difference. While the people around it wore typical 1908 attire, hats, coats, long dresses, the figure's garments appeared anachronistic, or at least strangely tailored. It was a dark, almost featureless suit, with lines that didn't quite conform to any known fashion of the time. The fabric seemed to absorb light, making it difficult to discern any texture or specific style. It simply looked different, out of place, as if pulled from another time or dimension. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the figure's face. Even with the most advanced algorithms working overtime, it remained largely obscured. It wasn't just blurry, it was as if the light itself avoided it. There was either a deep shadow perpetually clinging to its features, or an unnerving lack of detail, a smooth, indistinct surface where a human face should be. This absence of a clear face made it all the more unsettling, stripping it of any recognizable human emotion or identity. It was a blank canvas of dread. The expressions of the nearby crowd members in the photograph became a new focal point for Sarah and the team. Some were clearly oblivious, caught in conversation or going about their daily tasks, their gazes directed elsewhere. But others, upon closer inspection, seemed to be actively looking away from the figure. Their heads were turned, their bodies angled as if to avoid acknowledging its presence. A child clutched its mother's skirt, its face hidden. A man quickly averted his eyes, his mouth a tight line. It wasn't overt fear, but a subtle, almost instinctive avoidance, as if they sensed something wrong but chose not to engage with it. This observation sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It suggested that even in 1908, people might have noticed something, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. A growing sense of dread began to settle over the research team as the figure became clearer, its details more defined and yet more alien. The initial scientific curiosity had given way to a palpable unease. Sarah, who had first noticed the anomaly, found herself descending into an almost obsessive state, driven by a desperate need to understand the figure's true nature. She spent countless hours staring at the enhanced image, trying to find a logical explanation, a pattern, anything that could make sense of what they were seeing. Every new detail that emerged only deepened the mystery, pushing it further away from a simple photographic artifact. The team's attempts to find similar figures or historical accounts of such appearances began in earnest. They scoured archives, looking for bizarre reports, forgotten legends, anything that might describe a being like the one in their photograph. They found nothing directly comparable, which only intensified the unsettling feeling. The figure seemed to be unique, an isolated incident that defied categorization. One of the most striking characteristics of the figure was its apparent stillness amidst the motion of the crowd. While everyone else was a blur of activity, a snapshot of movement, the figure stood frozen, perfectly still. It was a statue in a living street, an unmoving anomaly in a world of constant motion. This stillness, combined with its unusual proportions and obscured face, made it seem less like a person and more like an entity, an observer from another realm. The first mention of the figure's eyes came from Sarah. After hours of painstaking work, using every digital tool at her disposal, she managed to push the enhancement to its absolute limit on the figure's face. What she found, or rather, what she didn't find, was profoundly disturbing. There were no discernible eyes. Instead, where eyes should have been, there was only a deeper absence, a swirling darkness that seemed to pull at the light around it. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a void, an emptiness that seemed to gaze back from the photograph, not with sight, but with something far more ancient and incomprehensible. This unsettling revelation solidified the team's growing dread. This was no ordinary man, no trick of the light. This was something else entirely. The implications of this discovery were vast and terrifying, pushing the boundaries of what they thought they knew about historical photography and the world itself. The photograph had stopped being a simple historical document and had transformed into a window into something profoundly unknown. The research team, reeling from the unnerving discovery of the figure's void-like eyes, understood they needed to expand their investigation far beyond the photograph itself. The scientific explanations they initially clung to were crumbling. This wasn't just a trick of light or a camera artifact. It felt like something alive, or at least something with a conscious presence. Their focus shifted from mere image analysis to a deep dive into local folklore, urban legends, and any historical accounts from the region where the photograph was taken. They hoped to find some cultural context, some forgotten myth that might explain this unnatural presence. They spent weeks poring over old books, microfilmed newspapers, and dusty ethnographic reports. They contacted local historical societies, and even some independent researchers specializing in regional myths. Slowly, obscure tales began to surface, stories passed down through generations, often whispered around campfires or told in hushed tones. These weren't grand, well-documented myths, but rather fragments of local superstitions. There were mentions of shadow figures, tall, gaunt beings that appeared and disappeared without a trace. Some stories spoke of tall men who watched from the edges of towns, never interacting, just observing. Others referred to them simply as watchers, entities that seemed to herald strange occurrences or significant events. The descriptions in these old legends, though vague and often contradictory, held an unsettling resemblance to the figure in their photograph. The unnaturally tall stature, the gaunt appearance, the sense of being an outsider looking in, these elements kept recurring. The legends often described these beings appearing suddenly, almost materializing, and then vanishing, as if they were never there. This mirrored the figure's static presence in the bustling 1908 street, a moment frozen in time where it shouldn't belong. The team started drawing parallels between the figure's description and specific elements of these legends. For instance, some local tales from the late 19th and early 20th centuries spoke of a lanky man who would appear during times of local hardship, like a severe famine or an epidemic. He was never seen helping, only standing silently, his presence an omen. While the photograph showed a bustling market, the year 1908 was not without its own social and economic anxieties, a time of transition and underlying tension. This prompted the team to wonder if the figure's appearance wasn't random but tied to specific historical moments. Their investigation also led them to explore similar unexplained phenomena in other historical photographs, not necessarily from the same region but from around the world. They found scattered reports of anomalies in old pictures, blurry shapes in the background, figures that didn't quite fit their surroundings, or faces that seemed too dark or too featureless. Most of these were easily dismissed as photographic errors, double exposures, or simple hoaxes. But after seeing their 1908 figure, the team looked at these other anomalies with a new, more critical eye, wondering if some of them weren't so easily explained away. As the theories began to emerge, they grew increasingly unsettling. Was it a psychological projection, a collective subconscious fear manifesting in local stories, and now, somehow, in a photograph? Could it be a rare optical illusion, a complex interplay of light and shadow that just happened to create such an unnerving image? Or, and this was the theory that sent shivers down their spines, was it something truly sinister, something beyond their current understanding of reality? The scientific explanation was struggling to hold its ground against the eerie implications. The team decided to consult with outside experts. They reached out to folklorists who specialized in regional myths, and even, cautiously, to paranormal investigators. The folklorists were fascinated by the consistency of the tall man or watcher archetype in various seemingly unrelated local stories. They confirmed that such figures often represented a personification of dread or an unknown force, usually associated with liminal spaces or times of transition. The paranormal investigators, on the other hand, were less tethered to academic skepticism and immediately recognized the unsettling nature of the figure, suggesting it might be an entity that transcends conventional understanding. A growing tension began to permeate the research lab. The scientific rigor they prided themselves on was being challenged by something that defied logic. The internal debate within the team about the validity of venturing into the supernatural became intense. Some members argued for strict adherence to empirical data, insisting on finding a rational, scientific explanation, no matter how remote. Others, however, felt that ignoring the folkloric connections and the growing sense of dread would be irresponsible, a failure to acknowledge all available data, however unconventional. The focus on specific details from the legends that eerily matched the figure in the photo became a crucial point of discussion. For example, some stories described the watchers as having faces that were like shadows or holes in the light, echoing Sarah's observation of the void like eyes. Other legends mentioned a profound silence surrounding these figures, a lack of sound that made their presence even more disturbing. This resonated with the figure's stillness in the photograph, a silence captured in a bustling street. The team was increasingly forced to confront the possibility that what they were dealing with was not just a historical curiosity, but something that had been part of human experience, albeit on the fringes, for a very long time. The question was no longer just what is it, but what does it want? Or even what does its presence mean for us now? This shift in perspective was profoundly disquieting. Sarah, driven by a growing sense of dread that was quickly bordering on obsession, couldn't shake the image of the figure from her mind. The original 1908 photograph was just the beginning. She spent countless hours staring at it, trying to find some detail, some flaw, anything that would explain it away. But the more she looked, the more real it became. The unsettling details from the folklore, the shadow-like face, the profound stillness, they all resonated with what she saw. It wasn't enough to just analyze that one picture anymore. She had to know if it was an isolated incident or part of something bigger. She started examining other historical photographs from the same period and general location. This wasn't a quick or easy task. Archives were vast, sometimes disorganized, and the digital scans, while high resolution, still required painstaking manual review. Sarah developed a system using advanced image recognition software to flag anything that even remotely resembled the figure's unusual proportions or posture. But the software was only a starting point. The real work was in the meticulous, almost maddening process of cross-referencing and zooming into hundreds, then thousands of images. Her eyes ached, her head throbbed, but she couldn't stop. It felt like she was looking for a ghost in a sea of faces, a needle in a haystack of historical moments. After weeks of this grueling work, she found it, or rather, she found them. Faint, almost imperceptible instances of similar figures. They were never as clear as in the 1908 photograph, always in the periphery, partially obscured by a lamppost, a horse-drawn carriage, or a cluster of people. Sometimes they were just subtle distortions in the background, easily dismissed as a flaw in the old photographic emulsion. But Sarah knew better. Her trained eye, now finely tuned to the figure's unique characteristics, could pick out the subtle differences that marked its presence. A slightly too tall silhouette, an unnaturally straight line in a chaotic crowd, a patch of shadow that seemed to hold more depth than it should. Each appearance was slightly different, a variation on a terrifying theme, yet undeniably linked by common characteristics. The same unnerving stillness, the same sense of being an anomaly in the human bustle. The clothing, while never fully clear, consistently seemed out of place, not quite fitting the fashion of the time, almost like a costume from another era, or no era at all. The locations varied, but a pattern started to emerge. They were all within a specific geographical radius of the original photograph's setting, usually public spaces, busy streets, markets, or parks, places where a strange figure might blend in, or at least go unnoticed for a fleeting moment. The revelation hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't a one-off anomaly. This was a recurring, deliberate presence. The implications were staggering. It suggested a being that could seemingly traverse time or space, appearing in multiple historical moments, a silent observer woven into the fabric of the past. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a pattern, a terrifying, consistent pattern. The team's initial reactions ranged from stunned disbelief to outright fear. Dr. Chen, usually a bastion of calm scientific reasoning, found his hands trembling as Sarah presented her findings. The pattern solidified, each new photograph adding another chilling piece to the puzzle, suggesting an intentional, non-random presence. The casual dismissal of photographic artifacts was now impossible. This was something real, something that had been there, watching, for decades, perhaps longer. What made it even more unsettling was the realization that these appearances often coincided with periods of historical unrest or tragedy in the region. A bustling market square just before a major economic downturn, a busy street corner a few days before a well-documented industrial accident. The figure seemed to be a silent spectator to moments of human vulnerability and suffering. This chilling thought took root. What if the figure wasn't just an observer? What if it was a harbinger, a silent precursor to misfortune? Its appearance a warning no one understood, or perhaps a catalyst no one could stop. The team tried to find logical explanations. Could it be a recurring prankster, a historical performance artist who managed to insert himself into multiple photographs? But the sheer consistency of the figure's appearance, its unsettling lack of clear features, and the vast time span between some of the photos made this highly improbable. The figures were too similar, too ethereal, to be a series of different individuals. It was the same entity, or at least the same typo of entity, manifesting again and again. The weight of this discovery pressed down on them all. They were no longer just historians or archivists. They were witnesses to something profoundly disturbing. The figure in the 1908 photograph was no longer just an anomaly. It was the clearest manifestation of a pervasive, hidden presence that had been lurking in the shadows of history. And now they had pulled it into the light. The question that had started as "what is it?" had evolved into "what does it want?" And then, most terrifyingly, what happens now that we know it's there? The air in the lab, once filled with the excited hum of discovery, was now heavy with a palpable sense of dread. As the investigation deepened, the atmosphere in the research lab began to shift. What started as academic curiosity had morphed into something far more personal, far more unsettling. The clean, sterile environment of the digital archive, once a place of quiet focus, started to feel different. It wasn't just the late nights or the pressure. It was something else, something subtle but persistent. Reports of cold spots in the lab became more frequent. At first, they were dismissed as drafts or faulty air conditioning, easily explained away. But then, they would occur in places where there were no vents, in corners that were usually warm. Researchers would shiver, pulling their sweaters tighter, even when the thermostat read a comfortable 70 degrees. Sometimes, a sudden drop in temperature would be accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible scent, like old dust mixed with something metallic. No one could quite place it, but it always left a lingering unease. Then came the whispers. Not clear voices, nothing distinct enough to make out words, but a low, murmuring sound that seemed to come from just beyond hearing, like a radio tuned between stations. It would happen when someone was alone in the lab, focused on an image, or walking down a deserted hallway late at night. A quick turn of the head would reveal nothing but empty space, yet the feeling of not being alone would persist. Dr. Miller, known for his dry wit and unwavering skepticism, even admitted to hearing it once, a soft, sibilant sound that seemed to brush past his ear. He tried to laugh it off, blaming fatigue, but Sarah saw the flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. Sarah, in particular, began to suffer. The figure, with its unsettling presence, had burrowed deep into her mind. She found herself staring at the enhanced images for hours, trying to discern meaning, trying to understand its purpose. This constant focus on the anomaly began to take a heavy toll. She started having vivid nightmares. They weren't always about the figure directly, but they were always infused with the same sense of dread and observation. She would dream of endless, empty streets, of being watched from unseen windows, of shadows stretching unnaturally long. She woke up drenched in cold sweat, the feeling of a pervasive, unseen gaze clinging to her even in the light of day. There was a constant, gnawing sense of being watched, not just in the lab, but in her apartment, on her commute, everywhere. It was as if the figure, through the photograph, had extended its reach beyond the digital realm, into her own reality. The team initially dismissed these occurrences as stress or exhaustion. They were working long hours, dealing with a profoundly strange discovery. It was natural for their minds to play tricks on them. They encouraged each other to take breaks, to get more sleep, but the incidents became too frequent, too specific to be ignored. It wasn't just Sarah. Other researchers reported fleeting shadows in their peripheral vision, a sense of something moving just outside their line of sight. They would blink, turn their heads, and find nothing. The feeling that the figure, through the photograph, was beginning to exert an influence was growing too strong to be simply psychological. The growing paranoia within the lab started to affect their work. Discussions became tense, arguments more frequent. Researchers, usually collaborative, found themselves snapping at each other, their nerves frayed. Dr. Chen, usually so composed, found himself checking over his shoulder constantly, his focus broken by every creak of the old building. The line between professional curiosity and personal fear blurred. The question arose, a chilling whisper among them: is the photograph merely a record or a conduit? Was their intense focus on the figure somehow energizing it, allowing it to seep into their world? One afternoon, Dr. Miller, the previously skeptical researcher, became increasingly agitated. He had been working alone in his office, reviewing some historical documents related to the photograph's location. Sarah found him pacing, his face pale, muttering to himself. When she asked what was wrong, he turned to her, his eyes wide with a fear she hadn't seen before. He claimed to have seen the figure, not in a photograph, but in his peripheral vision, outside the lab. He described seeing a tall, gaunt shape moving quickly through the trees outside his window, a place where no one should have been. He swore it was the figure, its elongated form unmistakable, even from a distance. The thought that the anomaly could manifest outside the digital realm, outside the confines of the photograph, sent a fresh wave of terror through the team. The psychological pressure became almost unbearable. Several junior researchers requested transfers to other projects, citing stress and an inability to focus. Even the senior team members, dedicated as they were, began to consider abandoning the research. The potential scientific breakthrough, the historical significance, all of it started to seem secondary to their own well-being. The thought of continuing to stare into the abyss, knowing it might be staring back, was a heavy burden. They were no longer just studying a strange photograph. They were grappling with a presence that seemed to defy explanation and threaten their sanity. The lab, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like a cage, and they were the unwilling captives of a silent, unseen observer. The question of what was real and what was imagined became a constant, tormenting companion. Despite the growing fear and the palpable tension that now permeated the lab, Sarah felt a stubborn push to continue. The terror was real, yes, but so was the burning curiosity, an almost desperate need to understand. The idea of abandoning the research, of leaving the mystery unsolved, felt like a surrender she wasn't ready to make. She believed they were close, perhaps agonizingly close, to a definitive answer. She proposed one final, unprecedented enhancement of the original photograph. This wouldn't be a simple sharpening or contrast adjustment. This would be a deep dive, utilizing experimental AI-driven image reconstruction techniques, pushing the boundaries of what was technologically possible. Her colleagues, though hesitant, recognized the logic. If they were going to face this entity, they needed to know exactly what they were up against. against. The goal was clear: to finally reveal the figure's face, to strip away the shadows and the distortions, to understand what it truly was. The stakes were higher than ever. They all knew this could be their last chance, or perhaps their last mistake. The setup for this ultimate enhancement was meticulous. Every piece of equipment was checked and rechecked. The most powerful processors were engaged, their fans humming a low, constant thrum that somehow added to the escalating tension. Sarah oversaw every detail, her movements precise, her face a mask of intense concentration. The agonizingly slow process began as the AI started its work. It wasn't about simply zooming in anymore. It was about the AI analyzing pixel data, predicting obscured information, and reconstructing what the original lens might have missed. Layers upon layers of algorithms worked to fill in the blanks, to sharpen the blurred edges, to bring into focus what had been hidden for over a century. The tension in the lab was a palpable thing, thick and heavy, like the air before a storm. No one spoke. The only sounds were the quiet whirring of machines, the occasional click of a mouse, and the shallow, quick breaths of the researchers. Every eye was fixed on the main screen, where the image of the figure slowly, agonizingly slowly, began to resolve. Each passing minute felt like an hour. Each subtle change on the screen sent a ripple of dread through the room. They had seen the figure many times, in many forms, but this felt different. This felt like a confrontation. Then came the moment of revelation. The AI completed its reconstruction, and the figure's face was unveiled. It was not a human face. It was not even a monster as they had typically imagined, with fangs or grotesque features. Instead, it was a void, an absence of features, a swirling darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Where eyes should have been, there were deeper, infinitely dark abysses, like twin black holes staring out from the screen. They weren't just dark, they were empty, yet held a terrifying depth that seemed to pull at their very souls. The immediate, visceral reaction from the researchers was one of pure terror, a collective gasp, a choked cry from someone in the back. Sarah felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a feeling far beyond any fear she had known before. It was the feeling of being utterly insignificant, of facing something ancient, something that existed outside the realm of human understanding. The figure wasn't just a strange anomaly anymore. It was a presence, and it was terrifying. The chilling realization dawned on them, not as a thought, but as an inescapable certainty. The figure was not just in the past. It was not just an image. It was looking directly at them. Its void-like gaze seemed to pierce through the century of time, through the digital screen, straight into their minds. It felt like it had been waiting for this moment, for them to finally uncover its true form. It wasn't a passive subject of a photograph. It was an active observer, and now it knew they were observing it. Just as this horrifying realization solidified, the lab plunged into chaos. A sudden, inexplicable power surge ripped through the building. Lights flickered wildly, then died. Alarms blared, a harsh, piercing sound that added to the pandemonium. Computer screens went black one by one, their progress lost. There was a loud pop, a smell of ozone, and then a profound silence, broken only by the frantic breathing of the researchers. The main screen, which had just displayed the figure's terrifying face, dissolved into static before going completely dark. The technological malfunction was total, catastrophic, and completely inexplicable. It was as if the figure, once revealed, had lashed out, striking back at those who dared to unveil its secrets. They were left in the dark, trembling, with the image of that featureless void burned into their minds. The confrontation was over, but the terror had just begun. The catastrophic system failure had wiped out almost everything. The enhanced data, the high-resolution files, and most importantly, the clearest image of the figure's face were gone, vanished. It was as if the data had never existed, consumed by the same inexplicable surge that had plunged the lab into darkness. The team sat in the eerie silence, the lingering smell of burnt electronics hanging heavy in the air. Their faces, illuminated by the emergency lights that eventually flickered on, were pale and drawn, reflecting a shared trauma that went beyond mere technical failure. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, Sarah was the first to speak, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "We stop," no one argued. There was no debate, no need for discussion. The unspoken agreement hung in the air, thick with fear and exhaustion. They had pushed too far, delved into something they didn't understand, and the consequences had been immediate and terrifying. The decision was made to cease all further investigation into the photograph and its anomalies. The original black and white print, the one that started it all, was carefully placed back into its archival box, then locked away in a secure, climate-controlled vault. It was no longer just a historical artifact. It was a Pandora's box they had almost opened completely. The psychological physical scars left on Sarah and the other researchers were profound. Dr. Miller, who had been so agitated before the incident, became withdrawn and quiet. He resigned a few weeks later, citing personal reasons, but Sarah knew it was the figure that had driven him away. Others in the team found themselves jumpy, constantly looking over their shoulders, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Sarah herself struggled with sleep. The void-like gaze burned into her memory, replaying in her nightmares. She would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced she could still feel its presence, a shadow lurking just at the edge of her vision. The pervasive sense of dread didn't leave her, even months later. The lingering questions were like an itch she couldn't scratch. What was the figure? Why did it appear? What was its purpose? Was it an ancient entity, a traveler from another dimension, or something else entirely, something beyond human comprehension? The answers, if they existed, were now buried, perhaps forever. The incident had taught them a harsh lesson. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors, once opened, reveal things that humanity is simply not meant to witness. The pursuit of knowledge, in this case, had brought them to the brink of something truly terrifying. The implication was clear. The figure may have retreated. Its immediate presence no longer felt in the lab, but its influence was never truly gone. It had seen them. It knew they had seen it. And that knowledge, that connection, felt like a permanent mark. The unsettling thought often crossed Sarah's mind. The figure's gaze, once fixed on the researchers through the photograph, might now be on the audience, on anyone who dared to look into the story of the 1908 photograph. It was a chilling thought, a subtle shift in the dynamic, from observer to observed. The enduring horror of the unknown was the most potent legacy of the incident. It wasn't the jump scares or the dramatic reveals that truly terrified them. It was the quiet, persistent question marks, the things that defied explanation, the realization that some shadows cast from the past can reach into the present, influencing lives, even after a century. The photograph, once a simple window into a bygone era, was now a historical artifact forever tainted by an otherworldly intrusion. It sat in its vault, a silent testament to a truth they could not comprehend, a silent promise of a presence that continued to exist, just at the edge of their perception. And sometimes, late at night, Sarah would wonder if it was still watching, waiting for someone else to zoom in too close.